Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas public talk series. Tonight's Giblin lecture is presented in partnership with the Economic Society of Australia Tasmania branch, and we're delighted to welcome you both here at the Stanley Burbury Theatre in Nipaluna, and those also joining us online from across Lutarina and beyond. I'm Mark Bowles, the Dean of the Tasmanian School of Business and Economics here at the University of Tasmania, and I'm delighted to be your host for Beyond the Breadwinner. Here in Nipaluna, beneath Kunyani, we acknowledge the Murawina and Palawa peoples as the traditional custodians of this land, sea, and waterways. We pay deep respect to elders past and present, to those who were denied elderhood, and to all members of the Aboriginal community here with us tonight. We stand for a future that seeks to understand and acknowledge Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history. Tonight's Giblin lecture is named in honour of Lyndhurst Giblin, an economist, statistician, and prominent Tasmanian. Indeed, economists who've been through Tasmanian Treasury would know the Giblin Room named in his honour. His influence on policy during the early 20th century was considerable and helped shape Australia's response to the economic crisis of the 1930s. He was Tasmanian and Australian government statistician during the Depression, and therefore an advisor to Joseph Lyons and Robert Menzies. This annual lecture carries forward the legacy of opening complex economic ideas to public consideration and using research to inform conversations that matter locally, nationally, and globally. For decades, economists have examined how gender norms affect women's opportunities, but far less attention has been paid to masculinity norms, the culturally constructed expectations, behaviours, and roles that are generally considered appropriate for men and boys, despite their influence on economic participation, well-being, and social outcomes. That is changing, and tonight's speaker is at the forefront of that change. Associate Professor Victoria Baranov is a leading economist based at the University of Melbourne, where she investigates how mental health, gender norms, and social pressures shape social outcomes, especially in the context marked by poverty, inequality, and historical disadvantage. Her work is widely published in international journals, and she is the chief investigator for the university's Gender Lab. Her recent work has focused on long-term effects of maternal depression and how disadvantage can be passed from one generation to another. To deliver the 2025 Giblin Lecture, Beyond the Breadwinner, please welcome Associate Professor Victoria Baranov.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Mark. And thank you so much for the invitation to give this lecture, Philippa and ESA, and also the University of Tasmania. I am delighted and honored to be here. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, I'd like to acknowledge the Muwinina people, the traditional owners of the land on which upon this lecture is being held today. I'd like to pay my respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal communities, all of whom have survived invasion and continue to maintain their identity and culture. This talk will have some sensitive content with regard to Australia's history during colonization, and I'd like to just acknowledge that and make sure that you're aware. So it is called Beyond the Breadwinner, this talk, and it argues for a more nuanced understanding of how masculinity norms shape economic, social, and political outcomes. So let's start with the question. So the answer to that question lies in society's expectations about the appropriate behavior that an individual must take depending on their gender. These are society's gender norms. Economists have been studying gender norms for decades now, but they have almost exclusively focused on women. They think that women are the ones who are constrained by norms. For example, women can't work, or women have to do this. Women can't talk to people that are not their family members. These are all society's norms that might constrain the behavior of women. But what about men? What about men? Do gender norms for men, that is masculinity norms, do they exist? Certainly psychologists, sociologists, and anthropologists would say absolutely. They exist. They've been studying them for the last 50 years. But economists, they haven't studied them. They don't think about how masculinity norms might play out in the economic sphere at all. And so they think, for example, implicitly, that means that they think that men are the default economic agent. So if we take seriously that masculinity norms exist, the question that we have is, how do they influence economic behavior? And so that's what this talk will be about. So first, what are exactly masculinity norms? Let's define them. And why do we care? Some broad motivation. Masculinity norms are socially constructed standards of male behavior and identity. So often they emphasize traits like strength, dominance, emotional control, and self-reliance. This is probably not a surprise to you, but masculinity norms, there are many. There are different kinds of norms, and they exist and differ across various cultures. However, these norms of strength, dominance, emotional control, and self-reliance are particularly salient and present across many different cultures. So we would like to explore the areas of potential influence of these norms. For economic outcomes, I'll motivate these in the three domains of economic outcomes, health outcomes, and political attitudes. I'll motivate it starting with gender gaps in these things. So we know a lot about gender gaps in economic outcomes, in particular with regards to women and the gender gap in, for example, STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and medicine, where women were underrepresented historically, and there has been an immense amount of policy to try to encourage women into STEM fields. There's a lot of discussion of women and gender gaps in terms of women's representation in the upper echelons of the corporate ladder. However, there's also gender gaps in terms of men, and there's too few men in other sectors, in particular in primary education and in nursing, so the care sector. And these gender gaps have actually been widening. They're getting worse over time. There are fewer and fewer men in these professions. And this is important because traditionally masculine jobs, for example, in manufacturing, are disappearing due to globalization and automation. All at the same time, the demand for workers in the care sector is actually increasing. And we're seeing men are reluctant to take those jobs. Could masculinity norms be playing a role in why men may not be willing to take jobs in these sectors? Another area where gender gaps are prevalent are in terms of health outcomes. You might well know, because if you read The Guardian today, it was one of the articles, that men have lower life expectancies than women do. This is true across the board, basically in every country. And it's true that men's mortality is greater basically at every age group. And so we have health gaps in terms of longevity. We have higher rates of suicide among men, 4 times more likely for men to take their life than a woman. Again, this is a pattern that's prevalent all around the world. Again, the question lies in, could masculinity norms that drive male behavior be partly responsible for why we're seeing men have health outcomes that are worse than women's in these spaces, in these domains. Lastly, in terms of political attitudes, what we have, a recent discourse has been around threatened masculinity, because, and how that affects a rise, or how that has increased sort of tendency towards populism. So threatened masculinity might be occurring because women have entered the labor force, as well as other reasons like enfranchisement of political minorities. And what we're seeing is that threatened masculinity might be playing out in the political sphere as well. So today I'll talk about essentially two pieces of research. This talk is split up into two parts. One is going to be about measuring masculinity norms around the world, something that hasn't been done before. And what I'll show you is how masculinity norms are correlated with all of these different outcomes that I've mentioned in terms of health, economics, and political attitudes. In the second part of the talk, I'll talk about the roots and consequences of masculinity norms, where I will give an example from a natural historical experiment. And I'll talk more about what that means in a bit. So first, to better understand masculinity norms, we have to actually measure them. Luckily, the psychologists have been busy over the last 50 or so years developing many different survey instruments to capture men's adherence to masculinity norms. And so what we've done is we've leveraged that work and implemented it in a very large survey across 70 countries. You see the image of the map of the world. This is where we've surveyed individuals. Some of these surveys were conducted in person, some of them were online. But overall, we have something like representation across nearly 80% of the global population in this survey, where we asked men and in some cases women, their adherence to masculinity norms using what's called the Conformity to Masculinity Norms Inventory, or the CMNI. So this is a tool that's widely used now by psychologists, and it's the most widely used tool to measure masculinity norms. We use a 5-item version, so we just ask 5 questions. The original scale is 96 items, so you can imagine that's quite a long interview. We don't do that. So we specifically chose 5 items that are focused on what we call dominance masculinity norms. So of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's different types of masculinity norms that relate to the breadwinner norm, or it could be the way that men relate to each other. And so dominance masculinity is very much about not just how men relate to women, but also how they relate to each other. So dominance masculinity is also the kind of masculinity that is defined as the kind of masculinity that reinforces men's position as the dominant social group in society. And so the questions that we ask are along these 5 dimensions. So help avoidance, the importance of winning, support for violence, control over women, and disdain for homosexuals. And the way the questions are asked they just ask the men to say, how much do you personally agree for yourself or disagree with these statements? And then we collapse these items into one index, and I'll refer to it as the CMNI. And you can see that we have quite good variation, because different shades on the map, different countries have lots of different shades on the map in terms of how they whether on average some countries adhere very strongly to dominance masculinity norms, and some countries much less so. And so once we have conducted this large survey and we measured these norms, we can then say at the country level, how does dominance masculinity, adherence to dominance masculinity predict, let's say, an economic outcome? And the economic outcome that we will consider first is GDP per capita, so economic growth. And here is the result of that data exploration. On the x-axis, so you see this is the CMNI-5, which measures conformity to or adherence to dominance masculinity, where a larger number indicates more adherence to masculinity norms, so more masculine. So on average, those are the countries that are more masculine. And then further along to the right, and on the y-axis, I have GDP per capita. And generally, you see that there is an upward trend. What that's telling us is that countries that adhere more to dominance masculinity norms actually have higher GDP per capita. They're richer. So that could be a good thing. Of course, this is just an association. Nevertheless, this is by direct contrast to another type of gender norm, which is the gender roles norms. So gender roles norms, I'll describe them in a second. Gender roles norms are the norms that have now widely been studied, and they basically are the norms about who should be doing what in society. And in particular, it's the norm that says, say, women should be at home looking after the children and doing house chores, and men should be the ones bringing in the income. So they should be the primary earners. So those would be the traditional gender roles norms that now economists and other scientists have measured all across the world many times. We also measure them because we think maybe they are correlated and relate to masculinity norms. And what we find, even though they are positively correlated, so people who are more traditional in terms of their gender roles norms, i.e., they think that men and women should have separate spheres, that women should be at home and men should be out working, they are also the people that are more likely to be adhering to these dominance masculinity norms. So there's a positive association between them. Nevertheless, when we look at how countries' economic development relates to traditional gender roles norms, we actually see a negative association. So the opposite pattern from what we just saw with masculinity norms. The more traditional the gender roles, the more likely that a country agrees with the idea that women should be at home and men should be the ones working, the less income they have. Of course, that makes sense because half of the population isn't working in the labor force. So this is a finding that's been shown before. This isn't the first time that we're showing that, but it is interesting that we're seeing these direct opposite patterns between the two types of norms in terms of across country correlations. So next, I'm going to talk to you about the individual level data. So I just showed you the patterns across countries. Within country, I'm just going to be, or with the individual level data, I'm going to be focusing on just if I'm comparing individuals within countries to each other. So an individual who reports higher adherence to masculinity norms, what are their outcomes like? And this is all data from within the survey. So at the individual level, masculinity is associated with men supplying more labor at the intensive margin. That means that they are willing to work more hours. They also self-rate themselves as more competitive, and they're more likely to be employed in a masculine sector. So greater adherence to masculinity predicts that they are more likely to be, doing masculine jobs and working longer hours and being more competitive. This is perhaps sort of passes the sniff test, but it also is in line with the positive association we saw just now with the GDP per capita results as well. However, when we turn to looking at the men's health outcomes, what we see is at the individual level, again, masculinity is associated with negative health outcomes and greater willingness to take risks. So I should say that, so in these figures, which I know the people who are listening in can't see, again, on the x-axis, I am showing adherence to masculinity norms, where the further you go to the right, the larger the number, that means more adherence to masculinity norms. And on the y-axis is a health index, which groups all of these outcomes together. And essentially what you see is a strong positive association. And in this case, what that means is more depressive symptoms among men who adhere more strongly to masculinity norms, more reluctance to seeking help for mental health issues, more willingness to take risk. And one of the items that we have is whether they wear seatbelts in the car, which is a really easy thing to do to not, to stay safe. And we actually see that masculinity norms are even related to that behavior. Okay, lastly, in the political sphere, this is an image that I'll just pause to describe a little bit here. This has become a very hot topic as of late. Masculinity norms and appeals to masculinity have become part of the political strategy in the last campaign for Donald Trump in the US. You see him here doing a podcast with Joe Rogan, who is sort of a canonical podcaster in the US who sort of embodies and is a sort of quintessential masculine person. And you see them speaking to each other at a table that has, I'm counting maybe 3 skulls and has like elk or deer antlers, you know, like a hunting trophy. And it's clearly like a man cave or like a den. And so it sort of exudes masculinity. And so you can see that, you know, beyond this, you've heard that the Trump tariffs were manly. So there's a lot of appeals to masculinity in politics right now. And so we want to see, again, in our data, which was collected, and in fact, like it spans the years, but is from 2020 to just this year, we see that, again, adherence to masculinity norms is associated with men's political attitudes. In particular, men who adhere more strongly to dominance masculinity norms are more likely to support strongman leaders, military rule, and they're less in favor of democracy or a free market. So the last thing that I do is I try to compare, or we try to compare how predictive, what is the predictive power of masculinity norms over these other traditional gender roles norms? Because we think, okay, well, is it one just the flip side of the other? I already alluded to it, this not being the case, because I showed you that at least at the cross-country level, the patterns went the opposite directions for masculinity norms and the traditional gender roles norms. Again, like the norm of women being at home and men being at work. So what we see here is in the blue line is much steeper than the red line. The blue line is adherence to masculinity norms, and it being steeper means that it has more of an effect on all of the outcomes than do the traditional masculinity norms. So what it's telling us is, overall, what these patterns are telling us are that like what we've learned about dominance masculinity norms is that they are predictive of behavior and outcomes, and that they're different from these traditional gender roles norms that we typically focus and fixate on about women. There may be, so we haven't proved anything, there may be benefits to economic growth, as we saw with GDP being positively associated, as well as, you know, intensive labor supply, their willingness to work more, and competitiveness. But there seems to be also potentially some costs with worse health outcomes, risky behaviors, and more conservative political views. Next up, so at the moment, what I've just described is just some patterns and associations across the world. I also should point out that I, you know, showed this to you collapsing the entire world together, but also if we do this country by country, we do see the same patterns. In some places it's stronger than other places, but it's almost universal. So the next part of the talk is going to be about trying to understand where these norms originate, where do they come from, and then what are their consequences in the long term. So economists and anthropologists have documented various historical origins of gender roles norms. So again, these norms about whether the woman should be at home or if she can be working. For example, they've shown that a technology, which is such as plow agriculture, has shifted norms in a way that made it more likely that women have to stay home with the children and less likely to be able to work, because plow agriculture is very sort of physically intensive. Men have the comparative advantage in doing that work because they have to use the plow and also direct a large animal. And what they've shown in those studies has been that the alternative method of agriculture was hoe agriculture, which basically everyone can do. It's sort of very manual. Everybody has to be out doing it because it's slow. It's an inferior technology, but men and women would be out, working with that. But then once the plow became available, if the location was suitable based on the type of soil, they would be able to adopt the plow. Now, this was 500 years ago. And if you can believe it, present day individuals who have ancestors that adopted the plow, which differentiated men and women in terms of their work spheres so that it put men out and women in the home, present day have gender norms that are more sort of conservative, i.e. that women should be at home, by contrast to individuals who had ancestors that did not adopt the plow. Okay, so what we're looking for is something like that. So this is for traditional gender roles norms. What we are looking for now is sort of like something that would create some sort of historical shock in the past, like the plow or other demographic shocks that have been studied, like war, that would also increase masculinity norms. And it turns out evolutionary biology gives us that that piece of information, because evolutionary biologists tell us that sex ratio is a driver of male-male competition. And male-male competition, when females, the sex ratio is the number of men relative to the number of women. When the sex ratio is high, that means that there's too few women and the males compete for each other. We know from lots of animal studies that when that happens, there is increased risk-taking and increased violence and increased competitive behavior. So you can imagine that if we create that environment in humans as well, and this has been documented in humans, that if you create that environment, you do see these increases in this type of behavior. So now what we need, if we're wanting to look at like the origins, the historical origins, we need to find a place that historically had very skewed male biased sex ratios for a long time. Can you imagine such a place? Yes. So as you well know, Australia Australia was a British penal colony, and from 1787 to 1868, so for a long time actually. Tasmania and New South Wales and ACT were primarily the areas that were colonized by convicts from Britain. They were shipped and transported primarily for petty crimes. These were not hardened criminals by any means. And over this time period, something like 130,000 convict men, but only 25,000 convict women were transported. And what we have in Australia then is a period of time where sex ratios were heavily biased towards men. There were too few women. What do you think the men were going to do? They're going to compete, right? So this increased male-male competition for these scarce females in an otherwise quite homogeneous environment, a similar environment. And we have spatial variation in sex ratios, and we've measured that in the data. So that's what we're going to use to study what the long-term impacts of that are. I'll walk you through in a second, but first of the idea in a second. But first, I'll show you how the sex ratios looked like. So again, this is the number of men divided by the number of women over time. So basically, what you see in the blue is a sex ratio in the blue area, which is during the convict era. There were 3 men at the start of the data. There were 3 men for every woman in all of Australia, which is a staggering sex ratio. And that number still is above unity, above 1 for the essentially for almost an entire century. So high sex ratios endured for an entire century in Australia, which of course is perfect for establishing a norm, because if you have this kind of behavior, lots of men competing for scarce women for a long period of time, this type of behavior of competition, aggression, and violence, risk-taking, might become the norm. So that is the Australian natural experiment that I alluded to earlier. So in the 18th and 19th century, we had male biased sex ratios. They influenced male competition, which of course affected male behavior in the way that we think is consistent with, in particular, masculine norms, and then of course sex ratios eventually equalized. There was no longer too many men. And there was then therefore no longer any direct reason for men to compete over scarce women. Because there's no longer a direct effect of the sex ratios, what remains in terms of how present day the outcome, like how whether these places are different in terms of their outcomes, has to be due to masculinity norms that have transmitted over generations. Because based on the previous slide, you see that basically after World War I, sex ratios have equalized. So now over the past century, there is no male bias in Australia. So whatever differences that we observe between places that had male bias sex ratios versus places that didn't would be attributed to differences in norms that emerged because of this male-male competition. So here we have the spatial variation, this you can see in the maps, the spatial variation that we have, it was very dramatic across space. So these are the historical counties that we have overlaid with the present day maps to then measure all of the present day outcomes. And so in between the convict past and the present day outcomes, what I'll show you is some evidence on what we see in the interim period based on the World War I, because we have this data and it's very interesting, but also there was voluntary service in World War I in Australia, which you might be aware of because it's a strong part of the national identity. Obviously, Anzac Day is a big is still a public holiday, and it's memorialized very heavily here. So, but of course, serving in war is highly risky and it involves violence. And so individuals that select in to serve in the war might be driven to do so because of strong masculinity norms. And indeed, appeals to masculinity were the key drivers of voluntary enlistment. This is not even just in Australia, but also in Britain, where there was something called the White Feather Campaign. So I can actually read that. I can read it. Okay. So the White Feather Campaign was a campaign where women would give men who looked like they could be serving in war a white feather as a sign of cowardice if they saw them on the street. Say, why aren't you serving? You need to serve. So here is a picture with an example of the White Feather campaign. Our boys have fought and made a name, bringing Australia into fame. Be not laggard, full well you know, honor demands that you should go to help a cause that's just and right, or else adorn this feather white. So this appeal to masculinity, to driving men into sacrificing themselves and potentially their lives to serve the country, is one way of us to sort of testing whether or not we think this hypothesis is true, and that we and whether we see, like in the interim period between the convict past and then the present day, this pattern of behavior, whether places with higher sex ratios in the past at present or during World War I sent more men to war than places with lower sex ratios, because the places with high sex ratios had more male-male competition, which again ingrained more masculine gender norms. So using some digitized data on World War I enlistment, which we have for Tasmania only, as well as some other data, we do see a significant effect of historical convict sex ratios on the share of men who volunteered to serve in World War I. And here is something quite interesting. When I looked at the enlistment data, I don't know if you can see down at the bottom who I saw in the data. It's Lyndhurst Giblin, in fact, the man after whom this lecture is named. It turns out that Giblin joined the Australian Imperial Force in 1916, and he served on the Western Front in France in the First World War, finishing with the rank of major. So he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Cross for his service, which is incredibly impressive given all of the other things that he had accomplished in his life. Okay, so that's an aside, and I thought that was really fascinating that I could find him in the data. Okay, so we have this interim evidence in terms of voluntary enlistment into World War I. Now let's look at what the present day consequences are of male bias sex ratios. So again, what I'm telling you is what happened, like if I compare a place, a historical county in Australia that had high sex ratios during the convict era to another county in Australia that had lower sex ratios, what are the differences in their outcomes today? And what we see is that historically higher sex ratios, like a 1 standard deviation increase in sex ratios, resulted in greater violence. So 8.8% increase in assaults, 12.8% increase in sexual assaults. We see greater risk taking, we see help avoidance and preventable mortality. We find 20.2% increase in male suicide rates in places that had historically higher sex ratios, 3.3% increase in prostate cancer deaths, and 18.2% increase in vaccine hesitancy during the COVID period. So this is putting together vast amounts of data, from administrative data to survey data to so on. We also see a more male stereotypical occupational segregation. That is, places that were historically more male biased have men that sort themselves into more masculine professions, and there's fewer men in more feminine professions. And lastly, we also saw an impact on the same-sex marriage referendum in 2017, where we see that this is also present in terms of that vote, where we see a reduction in favor of same-sex marriage in places that had higher sex ratios and more masculinity norms. So you can come up with a lot of alternative explanations and mechanisms that might also explain our findings. For example, it could be that places that had more men had different industrial specializations than places that had fewer men. And we check that. For example, in the 1933 census, we have industrial specialization exactly, and we see no impacts there. It could be that we have, it impacted local variation in education, employment, that was about isolation, or even the China shock. But none of those things either explain the results. It's not the persistence of conservatism in general, because we actually don't find that it's generally predictive of whether you vote for the Labour Party or the Liberal. There is it's not a persistence of criminality in general, or unhealthy behaviors in general. For example, for criminality, we don't see increases in property crime at all. So property crime is unaffected, but assaults and sexual assaults are. So several things we're able to rule out, several other ideas that we can rule out. So this sort of leaves masculinity norms as the mechanism. They're hard to prove because they're sort of difficult to measure. Besides the paper that I just told you about, I would otherwise have to have also done a survey and measured masculinity norms across Australia. And while we don't have exactly that, we included one question from the CMNI. Remember the inventory that measures masculinity norms that we asked across 70 countries. We asked one question for that in the HILDA survey, which is a household survey across all of Australia. And the question that we asked was, it bothers me to ask for help. So just this one question. And what we find using that survey data is that places that had more men, more convict men compared to more convict women, are more likely to say that it bothers to ask them for help. So this which measures this self-reliance norm. And there's no such effect for women. All right, so the question is about what are the mechanisms of persistence? How do these norms transmit from generation to generation, even after the pressure for competing for these scarce females dissipate? So sex ratios had equalized, there's no longer this pressure, but we have these norms. How do they go from one generation, from father to son? Well, for one, do they go from father to son, or do they get taught from kids in school, for example? So vertical transmission is within families. And what we see when we look at our data is that the impacts of convict sex ratio, historical convict sex ratio, is greater if you had a father who was also born in Australia. So there is evidence that if you had a father who was born in Australia, they were likely the impact was greater. However, the impact was still there and detectable even among immigrants. That means they were adopting these norms as well. And the question is about how were they adopting them? And here we see, this is what's called horizontal transmission, learning from peers in school. And we investigate that using data on bullying. And what we find is that places that had higher convict sex ratios are more likely today, at present day, to experience the bullying of boys and by boys. So this is evidence that, in fact, it's quite different. This type of persistence and transmission of norms for men is very different for the transmission of norms, gender roles norms, because the gender roles norms, which is once again the whether the woman should be at home and the husband the one working, for those roles, those norms, they tend to be transmitted just mostly within families, because you observe what your parents are doing, you see what your parents are doing, and that's what influences you to do that. That's what your learned behavior is and what you think is the normal thing to do and the right thing to do. You're less likely to make these decisions based on what like your friends' parents are doing, because you don't necessarily see them. You see your friends in school, but you don't necessarily see the parents. By contrast, masculinity norms are very much about a show. You have to show up and you have to show your dominance. And so yes, there is a role from learning about masculinity norms from fathers to sons, but there's also a strong element of learning about norms within the schoolyard from peers, because that is what really establishes dominance. Because dominance, masculinity, is not just about dominating over females, but also about dominating over other males who are less masculine than you. And so that dominance behavior has to happen among boys in school, essentially. Okay, so to conclude, I'll just summarize to say that adherence to dominance masculinity norms is strongly predictive of outcomes and attitudes across economic, social, and political domains. As you saw, they are also distinct from traditional gender roles norms that are typically just the concerned with women and what they do. Masculinity norms may benefit economic growth by increasing intensive labor supply and competitiveness, and that could explain why we're seeing a positive association with GDP. But there's some cost, because we're seeing greater rates of mental ill health, greater rates of violence, and excessive risk-taking. And lastly, from the last part of the talk, what we see is that these norms are mutable, they're changeable, and historical events can shape them. I think that also tells us that other kinds of things can shape them, like different policies. And there are in fact lots of new policies that are coming, targeting men to try to encourage men to have less rigid masculinity norms. And in fact, I'd be very interested to see how that policy space goes. So I'll finish off here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria, for that really fascinating presentation. And I know certainly as an economist, you covered some areas that we don't often think about, and those links into anthropology and some of those other behavioral sciences are really fascinating. So we're going to kick into the Q&A session now. We've got a microphone ready to go up the back. Over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Victoria. That was really fascinating. Look, my question is around the link between masculinity norms and GDP growth. Is there a possibility that masculinity norms have actually shaped how we choose to measure economic growth?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a good one. Absolutely. I think maybe it's maybe it certainly might capture how we measure it, but also what types of measures we think are important for society. So maybe economic growth is not the only thing that we care to measure. We think maybe we care to measure well-being and other such factors as well. So yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, next we'll take the lady down the front, but I'll read a question from our online audience first. So this one is that male characteristics or norms cited are often have negative connotations such as violence and competitiveness. Have there been any positive characteristics of the masculinity norms such as loyalty or mateship that have been identified in your data?
That's a great question, actually, and I should have spoken more about that. There are different measures and many different measures of masculinity norms, including some of the more positive ones. They're not all negative. The reason that we focused more on the dominance norms are because they were more obviously linked to these economic outcomes that we were interested in looking at. And so we could see that there were, the competitiveness was creating, so the competitiveness and the risk taking and the violence were all going together in a way that could both influence economic outcomes, but also the health and political ones. And so we were able to, so it sort of ties in all of them together. But there are other norms about, protector and provider that are not necessarily negative at all. And we need to study those as well. And there's, so Equimundo, for example, is an organization that is all about positive masculinity. And they do a lot of programming around measuring all of the different ways that masculinity norms and masculine identity is manifesting basically across the world. And they actually just received, the head of that organization just received $20 million for that work from Melinda Gates. But basically that is to say that that is important, and that's still somewhat missing. And we're hoping to do more research in that space as well. Yeah.
Great. So it sounds like it's quite mixed. And on that, I was really challenged today about how I would dress. Would I come along in the typical masculine norm suit and tie? And I did, but I tried to wear my most colourful tie.
I appreciate that.
To illustrate my individuality. We'll take a question from the front now.
It's fascinating research. I know running the null hypothesis is particularly tricky with social sciences research. You've demonstrated a lot of negative and positive associations, but I wonder if you have deliberately explored the null hypothesis to your thesis.
So, sorry, can you clarify what you mean by the null hypothesis? In this case?
Well, that in scientific terms, that's working out a condition which would disprove the hypothesis that you're investigating and deliberately investigating that.
I see. We don't have anything that's explicitly trying to work out like how to disprove that masculinity norms don't matter. I think in a way, what we try to do is try to prove the alternative explanations is the way that I think we do it, right? So when we have the historical study, what we try to understand is, okay, we see these positive associations with, for example, with crime, with violent crime. Is the hypothesis then the alternative hypothesis is, okay, it's not about masculinity norms, it's just about criminality in general. It's just that when you have too many men, they just become criminals. And that's the transmission of that norm. I mean, that's the hypothesis, right? Someone could make that hypothesis. And so the way that we could test that then is by looking at other, so we have like a placebo test, right? Which is or a falsification test, I guess. Maybe that's what you're calling a null hypothesis. And then we say, okay, well, what if we look at property crime? Property crime is a nonviolent crime. And if we see criminality being the driver, we should also see an increase in property crime. And we don't see an increase in property crime. So that's the way that we have worked out the null test or the falsification tests. So we specifically articulate what the alternative hypothesis might be, and then how that might deliver the tests that we would then conduct to see whether that alternative hypothesis is true. Yeah, if that makes sense. Thank you.
So we've got a really good question about the so what from one of the online viewers, which is, what kind of policy responses do you think could address the negative effects of these dominance masculinity norms that we see in economic and health outcomes?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think in the policy space, we probably could do a lot more in terms of, well, it's actually really easy to say more in bullying, because we know that we see so much of it starting there. And that if you can improve how children interact with each other and support each other, then you sort of have lots of cascading benefits. We know that bullying affects kids' mental health, it affects their learning. Like, so there's a lot of potential negative. And so then if you can target those the masculinity norms in that space, but that is also hard. I'm also well aware that I'm not the first person to suggest that we should try to reduce bullying. There's other policy spaces where there's going to be, there's actually quite a bit of research in terms of men's health. I'm sure that you have heard of Movember before. So there's a lot already of policy towards getting more awareness around men's mental health, prostate cancer, and so a lot of men's health issues, to trying to just get men to go seek help. And so they're trying to shift the norms, and a lot of the advocacy that they're doing and a lot of the programming that they're doing is around shifting the norms. But I think that the difficulty, is about finding what works. And right now, I think there's a lot of little things that are that are being trialed, and we don't have a great. I think the best would be to target schools, but I don't think that we have the solution, because I know that reducing bullying is difficult. Early intervention.
Early intervention is really important, isn't it? There's a question right down the back.
I was interested in the dominance masculinity, the 5 questions used to measure it, and the fact that I think only one of them refers to women.
Yes.
And I can't remember if you said that you had developed that yourself or it was developed previously. My question relates to how you know that men typically have higher responses to all 5 criteria than women do, and whether there's much variation, country to country, like for instance, around the help seeking or the violence measures.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. We did not develop that inventory. We borrowed it from the psychologists who have developed it. With regards to so the difference between men and women and the response, it's a great, that's the first question, is that do men actually report higher adherence to masculinity norms than women? And they do, very much so. So we've measured that as well, but as well as other authors or other studies that have done that. But so there is a difference. It's different in every country. So men and women respond differently. The men are more likely to adhere to dominance masculinity norms than women in every single country. But there's variation. Some countries are more and some countries are less. There's lots of variation across countries.
So leading from that, there's a really interesting question about causality online, which is a lot of the traits that you've identified with masculinity overlap with authoritarian, nationalist, or religious worldviews. Do you think that masculinity shapes these views, or could masculinity be an expression of a deeper ideological structure?
That is a fantastic question. So authoritarianism, yes. So I think that there are studies that that link masculinity to authoritarianism, and they're absolutely linked. I think it probably goes in both directions. I think it is likely that masculinity norms perhaps, so this embrace of dominance and hierarchy might also be leaning into make someone more likely to lean into authoritarianism, while also growing up in an authoritarian society might also make you more inclined to be to report higher adherence to masculinity norms, because that is your environment. So I think it actually, but I think that's a fantastic question, and we can't, with our data, I don't think we can disentangle it. I think further studies would ideally, at the very least, I think measure like not only authoritarianism or tendencies towards, authoritarianism, but also other questions like around social dominance orientation and all of those types of measures. I think that would be the next one of the next things for research to do. And so there's a lot still more to be done there.
So a bit of a feedback loop, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll take a question down the front.
Just wondering about often in the media here, like the concept or term toxic masculinity. Wondering if you think that's a helpful or useful concept, or is it more harmful than helpful in the conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the way that the word toxic masculinity, it was intended to be used by sociologists and gender studies folks who were using it. I think they meant to say that not all masculinity is toxic, but there are perhaps some elements of masculine culture or norms that can be toxic. And in that way, I don't see a problem with it. I think what is a problem, and that's why we avoid that term, is that it can be thought to imply that all masculinity is bad. And that's of course not true at all. Masculinity is not all bad. Men are not all bad. We cannot. So I think that there is a level of sort of understanding of like the politics and the way that things might be understood and used, and perhaps even like leveraged against by politicians and so on, that might be not helpful. And so that's why, for example, we don't use that term.
I'll take a question down the back now, and then one from online.
Sure. Thank you so much. Very interesting talk. I was wondering whether there'd been any consideration to biological drivers for some of the kind of the rubric that you used. So, risk taking, for example, is there a correlation to kind of levels of testosterone and things like that? Same with the kind of some of the strength differentials, desire for fighting, those sorts of things. And what, how does that maybe play into the research?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I was waiting for that one. And I think that we, in a way, can't rule out that there are some biological drivers that might explain some of these patterns, but I don't think that they're nearly strong enough to explain the variation and the overlap that we see between men and women. We think that there's just too much variation between men, like across men, that yes, they're like slightly different, or not slightly, but they're substantially different in terms of their adherence to these norms, but like there's a lot of overlap, and that suggests that it might be norms rather than so norms, which is like expectations and beliefs, rather than biological drivers. The other thing that I think we thought that maybe like we could study the biological element in the historical piece from Australia, because we could believe perhaps that like if there were so many men competing for the scarce females, this is sexual selection at work, like Darwinian sexual selection, and this would select upon like the more masculine men who had higher rates of testosterone, who were stronger, and so on and so forth. And if that was actually happening, if there was enough selective pressure to actually affect that, then we would be able to potentially see that in our data, because we have, for example, height. present day. And so if over all of this time period, we were seeing biology as being the driver, we would see that manifest in some biological outcomes, in particular height, which is closely linked to, for example, levels of testosterone. And what we don't see. So that's, yeah, we don't see any effects on height. So that's not to say that there isn't something a little bit there. We can't rule it out entirely, but we also see that it's unlikely to be the only thing. And also because because it's so variable across cultures as well, it sort of indicates that it's perhaps not entirely driven by testosterone.
So a question from online, what about changes over time? So do masculinity norms change over time? And if so, to what extent are modern masculinity norms a reflection of older masculinity norms being thought of negatively?
That is also a really good question that I unfortunately don't have the data to answer, because we don't have measures of masculinity norms over time. We know that gender norms about women have dramatically changed over time in the past, century. Essentially, they have dramatically changed, but so have conditions for women, right? Women have entered the labor force and so on and so forth. So you see really big shifts about women's role in society, which are partly driven by norms, but partly just a lot of which were driven by a lot of circumstance. But anyway, you see. But I think what you see in the gender norms about women is those are strongly correlated with a lot of demographic characteristics, whereas masculinity norms are much less correlated with demographic characteristics. It suggests that essentially, and I don't think that there was strong impetus for masculinity norms to change, actually. So women's norms changed a lot because they've entered the labor force. There's just a big revolution over the last century for women. And so you expect these norms to change, but why would men's norms have changed when there hasn't been like a dramatic shift for men? So I think that there is less change of masculinity norms, but we don't have the answer to that question. All I can say is that reading anthropology books or reading historical accounts, you see very similar tropes coming about what is expected of men. So that seems to be quite constant over time. So yeah, good question.
We'll take a question from the middle.
So the female sort of feminism has changed over the last 100 years. You talked about the female experience. Has that shifted towards being more masculine?
Sorry, so you're asking, have females shifted towards being more masculine?
Yeah.
I would say so. But I don't know that we have that. Again, we don't have that in the data. So we don't have, masculinity norms per se, or like adherence to sort of these masculinity norms. But what we see is women wearing pants. So I would say if I can gauge by just the amount of pants that women are wearing here, based on what I would expect a century ago, that yes.
So I'll take one from online. So I guess this touches on a number of fairly serious issues we see in society at the moment. So this question from online is, what study or advocacy are you aware of for males who have experienced domestic violence or family violence, abuse and coercive control? And has that had any impact on any of the data that you've seen?
Possibly the only one that I have seen is with Movember. They do quite a bit of advocacy and also research in this space. And that's about it. So I know very little about, I've seen very little and know little about what, about men and their experience of domestic violence, obviously, because the rate of is much lower for men, but it's not zero. So it's clearly an issue. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm sorry that I can't answer it.
All right, we'll take a question from up the top here.
Thank you for your talk, and in particular, the energy you're putting into answering these questions and the commitment to that. My question is back to the relationship between masculinity norms and GDP. and broadening that out to other measures, have you measured the relationship between masculinity norms and more distributive measures like the Gini coefficient, for example?
Yes, that's a great question. I think we did. And we see that there's a suggestive evidence that it's also correlated with more inequality. But it's, I think, statistically weak result. So yeah, sort of suggestive, I would say, but that's a great question.
So from online, an interesting detail question. Did any of the 5 traits that you've talked about have especially strong links to the outcomes, either in terms of GDP or health outcomes?
Yes. So with regards to the economic outcomes, in particular, the competitiveness question or the willingness to take, the one that asks winning is everything, or the winning is the most important thing, actually, is what it asks. That one in particular is very predictive of especially the economic outcomes. So there is a little bit, like, they're not all equally predictive. You sort of see it in the way that, as you would expect, the willingness, or it bothers to ask for help, is the one that's more related to depression. So yeah, there is some variation in terms of which one is more related, and it sort of is consistent with what you would expect.
All right, we'll go to the far right now.
Thank you. I'm really curious to know whether this research could be applied at an industry level. For example, in the military, where the sex ratio has decreased significantly in the last 40 years. However, the prevailing culture is very much masculine dominance.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, it probably is important for the military. And it's, I think what it suggests is that in places where there are, not just in societies, but also in areas within society and in places of work, in the military, in places like schools, where we see a lot of sort of concentrations of men, you might see exacerbations of masculine, like this sometimes aggressive dominance, masculine behavior. I think maybe an all boys school might be an example of that as well. But also in economics departments, classic example. We just talked about that. So I think that what it suggests to us is that having more equality in a lot of settings is perhaps can be beneficial in terms of reducing this tension of, or this tendency towards not dominance.
Yeah, so prior to this presentation, we had a really interesting discussion about which economics departments around the world were the most masculine dominated, but I'm not going to share which ones were at the top of the list. That can be done in private. I've got a question, which is, I guess, the inverse of that question that was just asked, which was, you mentioned that in the care sector that we've actually seen a decline in men entering into some of those professions. Is there any indication of what might be causing that, and also what can turn that around?
Yes, that's a good question. I think that is something that Richard Reeves, for example, has written a book about, of Boys and Men, and talks a lot about boys and men being essentially forgotten. So his angle and his lens is that they're being forgotten, like, from all of the policy that's being done, it's all targeted at like getting women involved into STEM and all of this stuff, and they're forgetting about men. They're forgetting about men and boys in schools. Boys are like, falling behind in schools. They're not doing as well, but they also don't see male role models at school. This is problematic because there's few teachers who are men, etc. So in terms of getting more men into these fields, I mean, it would help if they paid more, probably. But what we also see is that female-dominated fields are also likely to have lower wages because they're dominated by women. So if there is, essentially a female, a gender wage gap, or like a female penalty that is applied to essentially an entire sector, which we believe that this actually does happen, that indeed that's going to dissuade a lot of men from doing so. So paying people, I think, maybe more for these jobs, and also understanding that these are important jobs and acknowledging that these are important jobs. I think that would be a start. I think that's probably the first place I would go, because I think that usually financial incentives can be effective. Yeah.
We've got one question from down the front here.
Hi, thank you so much for that incredibly interesting talk. When you were talking about the perpetuation of norms and you talked about the vertical perpetuation, a couple of times you said fathers to sons, but we also saw examples like the White Feather campaign where women in society perpetuate those. Is there, have you or others looked at more, I guess, diverse reasons for perpetuation across generations?
So in general, in terms of studies of norms, they have looked at how they've looked at role model effects, which might be how you sort of other ways that you sort of inherit norms. If you're seeing role models or famous people or very sort of important people who are very explicit about their behavior and their norms, that you might also sort of are more likely to inherit them from them. Also, you might get it. So that term would be called like oblique transmission of gender norms. So you're sort of getting it from other areas. So it's not directly from your parents. It also is not necessarily directly from your peers at school. So this horizontal transmission, it might be a little bit sort of coming from other places. And so, yeah, basically there have been studies, not specifically necessarily to masculinity norms. So I don't know that we have any studies and that have looked at how. I don't think that there have been, but it's something that no doubt will be an important thing to consider.
Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of our Q&A session for today, and I'd like to now invite the president of the Tasmanian branch of the Economic Society of Australia to deliver the vote of thanks, Philippa Chong.
Thank you very much, Mark. But much more importantly, not to say you're not important. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been fantastic. Thank you for walking us through the measuring masculinity norms, the roots and consequences of masculinity norms, and all those questions that you answered fantastically, and the nuance around those norms. As Mark said, I'm president of the Economic Society of Australia Tasmania branch. Yes, nice and convoluted there. ESA Tas, it's the nice, easy way. And I'm honoured to be here today. I studied economics at UTAS, and I sat in the audience where you are now doing the first year maths economics unit. I remember doing that QEM, I think. I don't even remember what it stands for anymore. Doesn't matter, learned economics maths, it was great. So thank you very much as well to the committee that helped put the Giblin together. ESA has been, it's in its 100th year now, we're in 100 years, and the Giblin has been going since 1996. So it's in partnership with the University of Tasmania, and we're very happy to now also be in partnership with Women in Economics, the WEN network. So thank you very much for everybody here today. With UTAS, thank you. Thank you for the Island of Ideas team. You always bring wonderful ideas to Tasmania, and we appreciate that. And a huge thank you to you. So thank you for coming. It's lovely to see people in person. Thank you to people online. And I had the easiest job. I got to sincerely thank you all. So hope you had fun.
So thanks a lot, Philippa. And just a reminder that recordings of this talk are now available as a video or a podcast on the Island of Ideas YouTube and SoundCloud channels. So finally, please join me once again to give a special thanks to our speaker, Victoria Baranov, and thank you for coming all this way and presenting on such a fascinating topic.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.